I want to take a little bit of time and close out the conference here. There's some things that I want to share, kind of building on some of the things that Brandon was talking about in his keynote the first day. Give a little bit of a slightly different insight and vision into it, and share my thoughts on our community and the future and where we've been going. It's one of the things that I really enjoy talking about. I spoke at our first meetup, and that's one of the things I'm actually going to talk about here. It was a wonderful, wonderful event, and I'd been doing a lot of speaking even before that, really talking about CoreOS and the work that we'd been doing. And let's see, am I getting anything on the actual monitor here? I do not see it yet. So, let me know, hand or something, when the monitors are actually online back there. There we go. So getting that. Get this up. And now, start out here. So, I kind of decided that I was going to call this a little bit of jazz riffs, robots, and free and libre, open source, and distributed systems. So, in case anyone didn't know, that's me. I'm Redbeard. I run, a bunch of the infrastructure at CoreOS. That's how you can bug me. Also, just leave the Harrington off of it. I don't actually go by that. It's not all that interesting. If you want to bug me on IRC, I'm there on Freenode and FNet and all that. And to start out here, I want to talk about the weirdos of society, the people who do strange things. And I'm going to start by talking about Sun Ra. Somebody, bet you didn't think that was going there. Sun Ra was this jazz icon all the way from the 1930s through the 1990s when he ultimately died. And in 1973, he released this album that was called Space is the Place. Really kind of weird title. So let's have a discussion about time and space. Because I think that now is the time to think a bit about the space that we inhabit between open source and distributed systems. And the reason why that is we know why we're all here, even if some of us are a little too shy to talk about it. And that idea is one about community. All of us are here because we're building community around both development and day-to-day operation of distributed systems, executed in the spirit of open source software. And that's a really powerful idea. And I could sit here and show off numbers like this, and it would be pretty impressive seeing that over the past 2 years we've had, thousands upon thousands of pull requests. And then show how even in the last year this accelerates even further. And it's interesting. And talk about how folks like Jeff Levon is contributing and doing work upstream in Buildroot and all of these other projects to make ARM64 hardware support successful. And we talked about Frode during the initial talk, who did wonderful work contributing LDAP support for DEX. He worked with the CoreOS team and said that working with the CoreOS team and the community on the LDAP connector was a great experience, improved the viability of working in open source. Feedback on the pull requests with suggestions, pointers in the right direction when you're stuck, and constructive comments on actual problems helps everyone involved drive the project forward. That is why all of us are here. But, and it's really weird to just see one English word that we use so often just put bold, and it just looks strange when it's that big. But this discounts a lot of the aspects of the contribution of people in this community. And that's because community and contribution are more than just pull requests and commits. Community and contribution are about the way that users, use software and the way that they solve problems. And that's a powerful idea because it ends up with, folks like University of Indiana publishing things online about their curriculum and how they use it to teach distributed systems and big data platforms. And you heard yesterday Zach from Packet talk about how they, bootstrapped a significant portion of their company on CoreOS. And to go into even more detail, we've got Sam Tressler from Packet, who spoke at CoreOS Fest last year and gave an awesome talk called Hosting, or CoreOS for Hosting Providers. And at CoreOS Fest last year, I gotta say, it was pretty rad. It was great to have everybody there. And this year is even better. I have no compunction about saying that at all. This year is better. But the reason why I think that is that the music of my younger days, at least, taught me a very big lesson about this. And because of that, that's why I'm going to put Morrissey up there. And that's specifically because, to quote one of his songs, America is not the rest of the world. It is important that companies and startups and individuals, people who are in the US understand that there is a global community in South America, in Africa, in Asia, and in Europe as well. And so often people are myopic and don't necessarily have that view over a distance of the importance of that. And that is why CoreOS is here right now. Even as a tiny company, we wanted to be here to demonstrate, to bring a large portion of our staff and show that we care about this. Because our community of users is global. And we always need to be mindful of that. It's extremely important. And so now I want to change gears and back up for a second. Because it's easy to predict the future. Well, it's easy to predict the future if you just say everything that will happen and play revisionist history. That's the DJB strategy, by the way. But on a different note, we've got this guy, John McCarthy. For anyone who doesn't know who John McCarthy is, he did some kind of not all that interesting stuff, like creating the term artificial intelligence, invented the Lisp programming language. Along with Marvin Minsky, started the MIT AI lab, and then later started the Stanford AI labs. He did a lot of stuff, but the thing that I think is most germane here, because it gives this vision into the future, is that in 1961, while giving the commencement speech to MIT, said the following: computing may someday be organized as a public utility. Each subscriber needs to pay only for the capacity he or she actually uses. But through having this, you will have access to all of the programming language and characteristics of a very large system. In 1961, John McCarthy was explaining public computing and public cloud computing. He didn't know it. He didn't understand it at the time. He kind of created these ideas and wrote memos in 1956 talking about the idea of time-sharing computing and then helped drive that. But looking into the past and seeing all of this always guides our vision of the future. And we look at things like, the computers of yesterday, which were interesting because, after McCarthy's time, computers became smaller and smaller and began packaging or being packaged as kits. And then after that, we start seeing system-on-chip platforms that are developed and open-sourced. It's pretty awesome. And then even further, we come up with these ideas of open-source hardware as well, where you've got an entire platform where you can pull down the designs, you can have the chips fabbed if you want, and more reasonably, you can have Gerbers made and boards actually milled, and then you can load that firmware onto the chips and modify it as you please and redesign the cases. And the whole idea behind that, the thesis of what I am trying to say, is that open source is empowering faster change here. So it's the velocity of open source which unlocks the most power. And I want to take a look just for a second at how CoreOS has expanded that velocity. So let's take a closer look. Like I said, it's easy to predict the future. And on June 3rd, 2014, CoreOS ran its first meetup. We'd kind of been participating at other places, but we had hired a bunch of people at that point. Melissa, our head of marketing, she drove this. She told all of us. She sat down with us as developers and sysadmins and individual contributors and said, this is all of our thing. You don't need to just go to somebody else's event. We can do this ourselves. And other people will be interested in this. Now, I actually want to, apparently I didn't cut here, so I'm going to skip real fast. But so up until this point, CoreOS was basically two products. It was CoreOS, and then it was Fleet, or etcd. And, we kind of added Fleet in there as well. And Fleet was important as well, because at the time, if you wanted to run a service, there were two basic paradigms. You schedule it with systemd. You run it, if you need something much, much larger, atop Apache Mesos. And Fleet, the goal of it at the time was to fill that gap between the two. That everyone doesn't need the compute power of Apache Mesos. Everybody didn't necessarily have the Java infrastructure or the Java expertise to be able to bring those things online. And so Fleet was designed to solve that simple problem. Now, much as a surprise to us, people began finding crazier and crazier uses for Fleet, which still bite us. But that's the beauty of it. That's the thing that's exciting. That's the thing that makes me freak out and lose my mind, because you've got folks like last year in December, Verizon talking about how they use Fleet on 1,000 machines concurrently to bootstrap Mesos. What? I guess if we're going to go turtles all the way down here and start getting inception, that's kind of neat. But it fills in this idea that both Alex and Brandon knew that the key to continue what we had been doing all along was to fill the gaps and the white spaces in computing and in large-scale computing, and when possible, give folks a gap to go from one machine to 3 machines to n number of machines. And the next piece in that, when you start looking at this, is we acquired Quay.io. And Jake and Joey from Quay became absolutely integral parts of the team. They were the seeds that then began our second office and our expansion to global domination. But no, we knew that folks wanted to run their own infrastructure. That's the whole point of CoreOS. And we knew that folks would need this robust capability to run an actual, real, full-blown Docker registry behind their firewall. And that it had to be behind their firewall, because people want to control their data. They want to have that level of trust over it. And at that time, I wouldn't say personally that the path was dark at all. But for a lot of people, especially those without a lot of imagination about what was possible and what CoreOS could do, it seemed really unclear as to how we would walk some path and where it was actually going. And as we continue on with this, CoreOS releases Flannel, because we still had a vision of these various problems on how to run containers. And so we open source Flannel as a mechanism for taking the idea of a single bridge on a single host and extending it across multiple hosts. This is not some revolutionary idea also. Google had been talking about how that's how they did things. It's not like we sat there being the smartest people in the room. We saw the gap and we built the gap. And in parallel at the same time, the folks from Weave saw that same gap and built that same gap. And it was, this strange moment where we've been working on Flannel for a while, and then Weave is released and we go, oh shit. Well, it just validates the idea, and let's pound it in, homies, because this is great. Choice is always awesome. And that's kind of the crux of this. And it still, though, when people see this, the path begins to become a bit more clear, but it seems a little tight and just a little too winding, and folks aren't necessarily that comfortable with it. And so then, in December 1st, 2014, we'll say we did or what I call CoreOS getting ready for takeoff. We had this idea, and we released Rocket. we released a containerization engine because we fought and we fought, because for CoreOS, systemd is critical. To requote the title of Leonard's talk, systemd is, or as the core of the OS. And that is true at this point everywhere with Linux. It was not true necessarily in 2014. But now, unless you're hanging out with Peter Volkerding or some of the Gentoo folks, you're probably running systemd. Unless it's the weird hacked up things with Debian where they like run systemd and then from there run rc.local and do weird stuff. But it's progressing there, and it just makes sense. We needed a way of running containers reliably from systemd. And if we're going to go to this effort of writing our own engine, there's an absolute requirement, and that is to have a standard and a specification. And at the same time, we launched appc. We knew that collaboration would be the key to success of containerization. And if collaboration was key, then we needed shared standards to have an absolute requirement of how these pieces would run. And in this, we were joined by Red Hat and Google, an individual who was working at Twitter, and other individual community members. And Vincent, who was here talking, came to us and said, pound it in. Let's do this thing, because shared standards are good for everyone. Imagine having the internet without RFCs. It's not gonna happen. Imagine having telecom systems without the ITU. It's not gonna happen. And so appc started the path of trying to define these standards, being open to everyone and inviting everyone to participate, regardless of what company they worked for. And so folks from, companies who you wouldn't even necessarily think of, started having their developers get involved. And VMware incorporates Rocket into Photon, and dogs are with cats, and things are just getting weird. But one of the biggest changes in this, one of the big things about appc and Rocket, was making sure that the engine could be disassembled into multiple pieces. By the way, that is the actual Apollo 11 rocket. Just even at that time, folks knew, you got to be able to break it down. But at that point, that's where we became completely surprised for a number of reasons. Because by the end of December, we were contacted with not even a pull request per se. It was a set of issues talking about, hey guys, you put this tag in there to say OS, but it only says Linux. Well, yeah, because that's what we're building. Of course that's there. And a community members, a gentleman named Matej Pasternak, who from Poland here, created, through his project, 3 of Coins, created a new containerization engine called Jetpack. How many people here have heard of Jetpack? Okay, so, 4 or 5 hands. That's about what I expected. What Jetpack is an engine that utilizes the Linux ABI libraries and ZFS and jails on top of FreeBSD to run Linux containers on FreeBSD. Now, this is near and dear to my heart, because for a long time, I was a die-hard FreeBSD zealot. I can admit this. I can be at the Linux conference and admit this. And it really showed that when you do open standards and open specifications, it gives the community the opportunity to develop things in a direction that you never even thought people would want to do. But at the same time, they could self-organize around that to make that happen. And this is where, at this point, with Jetpack and Rocket and Kerma, which was another engine released, as well as a bunch of appc libraries like libappc, which was written in C++ and nose cone and some other stuff, we start seeing a bunch of interest. And, we get to this point where at least now we know exactly how this engine is going to be fueled. We don't know what it's going to look like exactly, but we keep getting the requisite steps, one at a time, one after the other. And we begin making it even more clear that the path that we're walking has been made wide enough so that anyone who wants to join us can come along. And the next folks to come along were equally surprising. And that was where folks who are here today, Lukasz from Poland and other members of the Intel SDIX team, and Arjen van der Veen and other folks contributed this idea and code for clear containers, referencing clear Linux. They took this idea of the stages of Rocket and introduced a stage 1 that could dynamically turn a Linux container into a VM. Remember, a Linux container, at least as all of us use them today, is just a tarball. There's no magic. It's just a tarball. It's just a tarball that you run with a kernel. And we laugh, folks have heard me say this a bunch of times, but I'll say it again. We laugh at Richard Stallman. We laugh at him because, we watch that video of him picking things off of his feet and eating it, and, it's like, okay, you play the clown. But he's right in so many things. Not Emacs. Vim is the way to go, but I'll forgive that. He's right in things like it is not Linux. It is GNU/Linux. And most people don't think about that distinction. But it's important to think about that distinction because it is a GNU userland with a Linux kernel. In the same way that you can take a GNU userland and combine it with a Solaris kernel, or you can take an Android userland and combine it with a Linux kernel. These pieces are modular. And in that, Intel created a mechanism to use KVM to slipstream a kernel in at runtime along with your userland and be able to turn it into a VM with amazing performance. Now you did not need to make the decision about whether or not you ran something with potentially untrusted code on the same kernel as your running machine. You could make that decision at runtime. And you could run the container, and you could as a container, and you can Control-C it and run it again and dynamically turn it into a VM. And you can Control-C it and remove a flag, and it's back to being a container. And in this, we continue to see the design of our Rocket evolve in both power and efficiency. So with AppC and Rocket, the path becomes to really start to get clear to the community. It gets wider, there's more light, everyone is more comfortable walking this path with us. And it's that we've had a clear vision all along. And CoreOS wasn't hiding it. It's just that people didn't see the forest for the trees. So let's go back to June 3rd, 2014. Let's go back to that presentation where during that meetup, I continued our mission through a few different stages. At first, we have to, it's weird seeing a mirror of myself doing the same position with a beard much shorter, but at first we have to help folks understand Linux containerization. And then after folks understand it, we have to help them deploy it. Figure out how to get these things even onto hosts. How do you make this happen? And that's kind of the next phase of the development stage. And now our mission is to explain how to operationalize it. And on June 3rd, 2014, there's a video of me saying, the container flavor du jour is Docker, and we support Docker out of the box. But we're not beholden to that. And we're ready for wherever that container technology is going to go tomorrow. Now, Did we have Rocket at that point? No. Was there Rocket code written at that point? No. But we knew that the community would need certain things. We knew that inevitably that white space would proceed. And it continues on even today. We were happy to open source Clair. And as you heard the discussion earlier, we hope that more engines like this continue to be open sourced, because this is the critical path to making sure that all of these pieces are more secure and making sure that all of these pieces have more and more growing utility every day. And the next idea behind all of this is to begin to get us to the point where the robots do the work for us, even if there's two T's in the. And we at CoreOS believe that the way that we are going to get these robots to work is through the use of Kubernetes. And through using Kubernetes, we continued to evolve the other pieces of our technology in the background. And what was once that quaint piece of cardboard is now ready to launch. We have people seriously using Rocket in production. We have now contributed the idea of RocketNetties, where Rocket can be the executor within Kubernetes, which now gives users the option of being able to run Rocket containers or Docker containers, and providing all of the additional mechanisms around those technologies that you would expect to see. And it allows us to continue to drive and compete to produce the best technology possible. And so with these ideas, I just want to talk about that we started with the smallest pieces. And then from there, we've kept our vision years into the future, because the vision of these possibilities continues to be ever-growing for CoreOS. And in 2 years, when you look back and find the things that I've hidden in these slides, you'll continue to see all of the pieces that we have been putting together and all of the groundwork that we have been laying to make sure that as this technology progresses, that it is functional, stable, trustworthy, and ensures your applications to do all of those same things. And so, with that, I say, join our community if you have not already. Frankly put, you're all here, so whether you like it or not, you've joined our community. As Greg said yesterday, 1/2 of all of the committers to the kernel have submitted one patch. And 1/2 of those left have submitted 2 patches. That means that 75% of the kernel committers are transient users who do that one small piece of work and move on. And that's okay. Because with this idea of many hands make light work, so will all of our software be built. And with that, we conclude CoreOS Fest. I say that I am honored for all of you who have come here today to join us. It's inspiring. It's wonderful to see the ideas both using our technology and inspired by our technology. And at this point, in about 60 minutes, we're going to be having a party with Worker and Packet. And we wish that all of you will continue this journey with us at Beer Weekend or something. But seriously, thank you all for joining us here today. We hope to see you at the next Tectonic Summit, at all of the CoreOS meetups, and most importantly, online where all of us exist. Thank you very much.